A World Economic Forum report has claimed that employers expect to create 69 million new jobs by 2027. At the same time, they are expected to eliminate 83 million positions. Now, this will result in a net loss of 14 million jobs, equivalent to 2% of the current employment. The Future of Job Reports 2023 released on Monday, which was yesterday, suggested that almost a quarter of jobs, 23% to be precise, are expected to change in the next 5 years through growth of 10.2% and decline of 12.3%. So decline there, of course, more than the expected growth. The World Economic Forum's report said that India will see a 22% churn as compared to the global average of 23, doing slightly better there. We will, of course, discuss those big numbers and the overall job market in India. With me at this point in time, Barnik Chitran Maitra, who is the managing partner and head of R30 Little India and South Asia. Also with me is Munira Loliwala, who's a representative at Team Lease. Joining me in the studio, my colleague Karthik Malhotra. I'm given to understand our guests are with us. I'm going to begin straight away with Barnik. Barnik, what do you make of these numbers?
So I always take these numbers with a little bit of a pinch of salt because we've been talking about job loss due to technology and automation for a long time, right? And if you're sitting in India, the job growth has only continued, right? So I think the fears of technology reducing jobs in emerging markets like India, which are low-cost markets, is a little bit, I would say, alarmist and not in line with reality. It is a fact that if you're in India, you have to upskill yourself to be attuned to latest technology trends. You have to reskill yourself. And employers, particularly in the tech sector and the IT sector, need to invest in that. But I would be a little skeptical of these job loss numbers, particularly when they're applied to a country like India.
Okay. Munira Loliwala is also joining us from Team Lease at this point in time. And before we go to numbers there as far as, largely job losses in India is concerned, or the employment as we see it looking forward in 2027, which is what the data pertains to, I want to talk about participation of women in labor workforce globally and in India. India particularly, because the numbers are not looking good. While Indian economy has grown at least 10 times since 1991 up until 2021 and now 2023, the participation of women in labor workforce seems to be declining and declining there by more than 10%. What does it really tell you about what is stopping women from either being a part of the labor force, or what are the factors that hinder, women's participation?
So I think, Shweta, let's look at one more side of the number. While I see the participation ratio declining, you'll also see that in the last 3 to 4 years, the participation of women in STEM has increased. It has always been the highest when it comes to India, where women, workforce has participated in STEM graduation. The problem is in basically the STEM participation and then the STEM continuation of those roles. So by the time the women workforce reaches to the completion of their STEM degrees, they are opted either to kind of take family route, or they are opted to kind of take breakages in work, which has not been supported. So if you look at the traditional workforce environment of India, we largely are a manufacturing country, right? And that's exactly where you need more labor on the field, in the plant, which possibly have not been favorable conditions for women. But now, as you see the future, things have changed. So now we have a technological advanced workforce. We now have automation. We now have digitization, artificial intelligence. I think these kind of changing the whole scenario. While you largely need to look at how you can have a balanced, gender balanced workforce culture, which most organizations today are looking at creating, most government institutions are looking at creating. So you now have these.
Okay, we seem to have lost Munira there, but I want to come back to you, Barnik, at this point in time. Do you agree with Munira that even though there is an overall decline, there seems to be some upward movement as far as STEMs is concerned, but science and technology alone is not going to drive women's participation in the labor workforce?
Yeah, so I think let's look at the picture in two ways, right? If you look at the workforce in India, I think it's formal and informal. And if you look at the formal workforce, particularly across services, manufacturing, you will see that women's participation numbers typically tend to be higher. I think in the informal workforce, I have a sense that women are far more undercounted than the numbers itself. There is a lot of informal work which women do, which are not counted. Often they don't get paid for it. So that's another bigger challenge. So I think the problem is endemic. It's endemic in areas like agriculture, light manufacturing, where women are not employed as high as other sectors. And even if they are employed, they may not be paid or may not be counted. While there is an uptick in sectors like healthcare, technology, startups, I don't think that's enough, right? It's quite shameful that in India, the women labor participation is between 20 to 30%, whereas for males, it's around 70% plus. I think we need to do more to actually get women into the, jobs which are getting created, ensure they get paid, and then they get counted in the job workforce.
Okay. Now, you pointed to something very interesting. You said that most of the women are employed with labor force which does not really pay them, which is usually unpaid labor or care work. And this is where also we see a lot of gender disparity, where men are essentially in paid positions. Women are doing a large part of, household chores, they're doing care work for which they are not paid. What sort of intervention can we expect, economically or from government at this point in time to bridge this gap, the gap that exists between men and women as far as, parity in workforce is concerned? Because every survey after survey suggests that the country will not do well unless we get more women into workforce.
Yeah, so I think let's look at all the stakeholders. Let's start with corporates and enterprises who are employing women. I think they all need to hold themselves to a far higher standard, ensure that if you look at non-executive workforces, at least 50 to 60% of women are given opportunity and are hired. I think it often helps to have informal, I won't call them quotas, but I'd call them affirmative action targets, right, where you are saying that X% of the intake has to be minimum women. And I've always found that if organizations set themselves high goals like 50, 60%, they often get there. So that's one important, I think corporate India needs to step up and they themselves need to set very high aspirational targets to welcome women into the workforce. Secondly, if you look at even in corporate India, there's a huge loss of women manpower, particularly after maternity. So I think corporate should invest in creating return to work programs for women who were part of organizations and who then gave up to either raise a child for a few years and want to get back into the workforce. So return to workforce for early moms who have now gone through maternity, have gone through some years of childbearing, and are interested to come back to the workforce needs to be encouraged. I think if you look at the government, I think the government can play a role in probably creating some kind of equalization mechanisms. Again, I don't like the use of market distorting mechanisms like subsidies or tax rebates, but certain encouragement on incentives, maybe a 2-3% additional tax incentive if you have more than 50% of women workforce. If you're looking at all the schemes, having a little bit of a woman prerequisite to qualify for various subsidy and various incentive schemes would certainly help, right? Again, we have to be careful that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, that the government is investing a lot of money to add production and manufacturing capacity, but they're tying it loosely over the medium term to some gender parity targets would certainly be the necessary nudge corporate India needs to ensure that they're focusing on women and gender parity.
Hey Barnik, Karthik here, nice to connect with you. Just wanted to get your views, Barnik. I was listening to this very interesting podcast around impact investing, and this is a new trend of investing which is supposedly different from ESG investing, which is backward looking on the scores of organizations. It is somewhat different from a regular PE or VC investing, and the whole purpose of impact investing in startups and corporate India as a whole, or corporate world as a whole globally, is that you invest in companies where there is a defined target, a defined impact that needs to get accentuated or accelerated. So in the case of encouraging more women participation, do you see the role of this particular new age impact investing as playing a significant role in really bridging the gender gaps that you and Shweta were talking about, and also the parity between men and women doing the same labor? Not just on the factory floor, but even in more white-collar jobs. this pay gap between equal work but unequal wages is also fairly significant. So how do you see the role of something like impact investing here?
So, listen, impact investing has a role, right? I think the beauty of impact investing is that the dollars flow to real social impact projects. If you look at a lot of impact investing themes, reskilling and women empowerment are important themes. So, I think this is a good trend, and if India sees more impact investors, it's actually going to further a lot of social upliftment causes. But again, I come back, I don't think it's enough, right? We have to be careful as to what is necessary and what is sufficient. Impact investing plays an important role, but I think the entire corporate, MSME, government sectors need to be far more proactive and far more, I would say, aggressive on parameters. The National Council for Women, I think in 2014 or 15, when the Honorable Finance Minister was a member of the council, had come up with gender budgeting, right, which is a very unique way to look at how women can be empowered within organizations, right? So practices like this should flow right down from top corporates to smaller corporates, where they are encouraged, right, to hire more women, bring them on board, and maybe a little bit of an incentive push, a small carrot and a small stick will help. Right? So again, short answer: impact investing helps, but the scale of it will not cover the full gap. Maybe it's a good catalyst, but more needs to happen to get gender parity in the workplace for women.
Okay, I want to move beyond gender parity and talk about the overall job market in India. Not looking very good, slightly better than what we're looking in the West, but still the job losses are at an all-time high. We are, every other day we're covering job losses in IT sector, we are covering job losses in the white-collar jobs particularly. At the same time, we're now talking about job losses which could be as much as 12.3% decline year on year in the next 5 years. And this is not just a global phenomenon, this is also India-specific. As I said, slightly better here, but not looking very good. If I compare this with EPFO numbers, because this is something we would been discussing and we were discussing this morning, more and more people enrolling into a EPFO, which is a suggestion that yes, we are creating jobs, but just not enough.
So see, the unemployment rate in India has been under check for the last many months. We saw the unemployment rate hitting the double-digit figure, going as high as 12.2% if I remember correctly, in the thick of the second wave of the pandemic around 2021. Thereafter, we've seen that the unemployment rate has come to single digits, right? It's still high. If estimates are to be believed, it is still in the range of 7 to 8%, which is, which is at par with other global economies. But I think what we really need to work towards, in addition to job creation, is job diversification. And I think that is where it is important to also understand that the data being collected right now on potential, growth in jobs and going away of jobs is keeping certain themes, certain sectors in mind, IT specifically, largely because you're looking at new AI-driven technologies coming in and this whole sort of, generative AI phenomena where people assume that AI is going to eat away jobs. But what needs to also be looked at in the same light is the new kind of jobs that get created. Perhaps some of these may not be entry-level jobs. Some of them could very well be only entry-level jobs of putting in the right query for an AI chatbot to answer. But many of these jobs are actually going to be training jobs for AI algorithms as well, feeding data into AI algorithms. It's going to pick up, it's going to amass that data, it's going to learn on it, and then the next level of technologies will be built on top of the layers of technologies that we have right now. So again, like Barnik said, I don't think we should go by numbers, and that too sort of preemptive numbers which come in, which will fructify or not much later in the lifespan of those numbers. But look at the trend lines, and overall, if the unemployment rate is under check, more number of people are added to the workforce every year, then overall I think we are moving in the right direction.
Okay, I mean, look at the trend line.
Look at the trend line. Look at hard data, not look as much as crystal ball gazing, because you don't know what are the assumptions that have gone in. You really don't know what sectors, what parameters have been accounted for, and data accuracy, especially we've seen it in the past, these big Western organizations coming out with big numbers and throwing them our way. More often than not, they don't really cut eyes.
Okay. Munira is back with us. Munira, do you agree? Data, at least, in the next 5 years, could be very presumptive if we are to look at what's to come in 5 years, 10 years time, and perhaps the need of the hour is to look at the trend line, and trend line suggests that yes, there is more use of machine learning, AI, and generative, AI, as Karthik pointed out, and that could change the way jobs are worked on, perceived, and what kind of job roles that will be created in the next couple of years.
Absolutely, I do agree. I think there's a lot for us to right now constantly unlearn, learn, and relearn. We are in that mode. However, I would also look at the trend because India is at its demographic dividend advantage. We are basically the third largest when it comes to the startup ecosystem. We have women now today at 26% of the entire IT workforce. All of this add to our advantage. However, we also have larger cities now which we want to grow so that more jobs can be taken to people. And that's where you grow your rurals, your B towns, and your other areas. I think looking at that, if you see today, for most of us to kind of stay in the ecosystem of the workforce, it's important to look at what are these skill sets. Earlier, Shweta, we would, and you would agree with me, we were talking more about the education and the degree. But today, along with that, we're also talking about analyticals, problem solving, communication, multidisciplinary design kind of skill sets. I think these are the kind of more future requirements that will spike the need of the demand. These are a combination of skill sets. We also see a trend of kind of a lot of cross-functional education being looked at. If you see the clean energy, the EV segment, or rather the net zero impact that we're trying to make in India by 2070, all of this do not really hire the traditional way. So we look at a lot of chemical engineers being part of now the EV ecosystem, automotives, which have never hired out of their comfort zone. So I think these are the few dynamics and changing trends. And I think for the future applicants, or rather the future workforce, it's really important to take advantage of the new education policy, look at diversifying the way they can design or look at the curriculums, work with government and organizations to have better skill set certifications, not just degree certifications.
Okay.
So I think that's how it will
Diversify skill sets. How do we do that, Barnik, in your assessment to increase your employability and looking at trends where most fastest declining job roles in fact are with people who are in daily manual labor, for example, bank tellers, cashiers, data entry operators, which requires more sort of number churning and in fact even in technology and digitization, when people are losing out jobs in these sectors, what kind of skills do we need to remain employable?
Yes, Shweta, if you don't mind, I'll just like to present first a counterpoint to the full narrative which is going on, right? See, if you take the numbers, India roughly has a workforce of 500 million. It's actually around 470, 480 million, but I'm using 500 to make math a little easier. Only 15% of that workforce is organized, and probably less than 40% of that workforce is actually in the sectors we are talking about, right? So when we talk of headlines of job losses, right, the IT sector amongst itself employs barely 3-4 million people out of the 500 million people. The tech sector maybe employs another million, right? So when we look at job losses, I think we have to take it in context of the big numbers. And India is going through a major transformation in agriculture, manufacturing, infrastructure. And the reason why we are at 7.9% unemployment rate is those sectors are also creating a lot of jobs. So I think for India to create more employment, I think we need to have employees who can work in these future sectors. I think the colleague from Team Lease pointed out some of these sectors, but a lot of the new jobs in India will be created in sectors like precision manufacturing, in infrastructure, in construction, which is where India needs a lot of infrastructure investments. So for me, on balance, I wouldn't be too worried about a few million job losses in IT. In fact, the numbers are probably less than even a million. Now,
Okay.
coming to the question of what people need to be ready for, again, as a policy maker, you should segregate your workforce into blue collar and white collar. I think for blue collar, significant investments are needed in skilling the labor of tomorrow and working in some of these industries which are a little bit higher tech than original simple assembly. So if you look at the entire manufacturing space again, let's look at simple iPhones, right? It started with assembly, now it's gone to manufacturing, and then we have 2, 3 semiconductor fabs also coming up. This means that your ordinary labor force needs to get better trained. which is why investments in ITI and other training institutes makes a lot of sense. Now let's look at the white collar workforce. And again, I'll tell you an anecdote. We were having a discussion with some radiologists, and there was a lot of discussion on whether AI would replace radiologists. And the consensus in the room with was that radiologists who know how to use AI will replace radiologists who don't know how to use AI. So I think in general, there is a need for people to understand technology, to get themselves trained. Companies may need to invest in, or you as an individual professional should also invest in getting to know some of these technologies, because people who know this technology will soon replace you if you don't come
Absolutely.
up. So I think
Okay.
that's the split. Again, I am very skeptical of these job loss numbers for India. If any, I expect there to be another 100 million new jobs created in India over the next decade. So again, I think I just find the findings of the WF report a little mystical, right? If I look at the economy we are in and the growth we are expected to see over the next decade.
Okay. I think interesting point there, Karthik. It's not that technology will replace you. It's that the absence of knowing technology, and a person who knows technology, perhaps that person will replace
Absolutely,
you.
I agree with what Barnik is saying 100%. But Barnik, I want to understand from you, at some level, do you think there is going to be some consolidation also in the overall job scenario? For example, we are seeing that, EdTech, for example, is losing people right now. EdTech as a company, but the kind of employees it is losing again happen to be those who do understand technology, those who do understand product, or those who at least do understand education. So is there going to be some consolidation in terms of job losses from one sector, creating room for those employees to be accommodated in other sectors, similar or disparate?
Yeah, so let's look at startups, right? I think in 2021, with the funding boom and with the sudden expansion of digital revenues, all startups overhired. And this was not just an India phenomenon, it was a phenomenon around the world, including big companies like Alphabet and Facebook also doing the same. What we are now seeing is rationalization of hiring and actually choosing winners from losers, right? It's only in a funding winter that you realize which businesses are scalable and which are sustainable. Now, if you look at the job losses in the tech sector, there have been two kinds of job losses. One has been purely white collar, high tech, highly educated folks who have got fancy advanced degrees and have a good mooring in tech. For them, I think the job loss is not a big setback. They actually can easily go and either work in another startup or go back to industry, work for an IT company or even in a physical retail company, because those skills are very transferable, right? If you're at a startup, a tech startup who knows how to build a tech stack, you can easily go and join a product or tech team at a bank as well. So
Correct.
that's how fungible some of these skills are. But a lot of these startups also employ a lot of blue collar workers, right? Let's look at all the delivery folks, all the folks who are running all the feet on the street kind of campaigns,
Where
right?
also there is consolidation happening. So you
There
have
is
companies which are
consolidation
coming up,
happening.
which
And
are
those
catering to multiple
employees,
clients.
by the way, those employees are not that employable outside their immediate context, right?
Correct.
I think the crisis is more for the blue collar workers who are employed for startups, because they are finding it very difficult to re-employ themselves. A lot of them have made investments in vehicles. If you look at the entire strike which Blinkit faced in Gurgaon last week, right, where they decided to cut delivery fee and
Correct.
suddenly all the gig workers went on strike. I would be far more concerned about that segment of the workforce finding a job quickly. And for them, you actually need to have scale profitable startups for that to be sustainable jobs which last beyond the funding boom.